While it was the gold rush that drew the first Chinese immigrants to America, the history of how Chinese laborers helped build the country kicked off in the 1860s with the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad under the helm of American industrialist Leland Stanford.
He was looking for the hardest workers, the best laborers to build the railroad and connect the remaining part of the 1,700 miles of track from the West Coast and the middle of America. And he said, why not those Chinese? They built that wall.
20,000 Chinese men worked on the western section of the railroad, accounting for as much as 90% of that workforce. Although known for their tenacity and willingness to work in a job shunned by others, many froze to death in the cold winter months or lost their lives on the job.
And yet, on May 10th, 1869, in this photograph of the celebration of the completion of the railroad, there are no Chinese American faces in this photograph. The hard work of completing this nation, which ended up becoming the foundation for the future wealth of this country, is not celebrated by those who really gave their lives to this effort.
Not celebrated, but also hardly acknowledged.
In doing my research for this story, it became quickly apparent that there's a dearth of information on the history of Chinese labor in America. And historians say it is this lack of information and education that has obscured the important role that Chinese immigrants have played in building this country.
When the tracks were completed in 1869, Chinese laborers who remained in America found themselves looking for work in the wake of the American Civil War.
So in some ways, as slavery ended, people were looking for indentured slaves, home staff, and the Chinese really filled that position in many different ways.
Others worked as laborers in land reclamation, irrigation, and agriculture. With their numbers growing, Chinese immigrants were now more exposed, more visible, and increasingly seen as a threat.
They had their long queues, they had their foods that they were eating, they had their different types of Chinese robes. So immediately some of the opportunities for them disappeared. There were sentiments in town halls, anti-Chinese, mass meeting, come out, fight against the Chinese taking your jobs. Chinese? No, 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 1892.
The animosity boiled over into deadly violence, from the Chinese massacre of 1871 in Los Angeles to the San Francisco riot of 1877 and the Hell's Canyon massacre in Oregon that same year. And then another mining massacre in 1885 in Rock Springs, Wyoming.
But also the most imperative part of this period of time that is missing from our textbook is all the legislation against Chinese and Asians in the United States. And it really culminates in the most significant one, which is 1882. That's when Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act.
The Exclusion Act suspended Chinese immigration and prevented the Chinese already in the country from becoming American citizens.
The unfortunate reality of what we face today is some people are like, how could this happen, AAPI? And, this is the first time. It's not. Anti-Asian American, anti-Chinese discrimination started more than 100 years ago.
The Chinese Exclusion Act led to the formation of Chinatowns across the country, safe zones for the Chinese to live and make a living in a time of fear. Within these communities sprung hand laundries and Chinese restaurants that have defined much of the Chinese-American experience and endured in the decades to come. Liling, CGTN, at the Museum of Chinese in America in New York.